Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to begin tonight by thanking our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CIGI's signature lecture series. I'd also like to thank our event co-sponsor, the Balsley School of International Affairs, for their support in making this event possible. A special word of welcome to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast tonight. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences. Our live audience is invited to use the microphones here at CIGI in the aisles. And if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll pass those questions to our guests on stage. A reminder for questioners to please state your name and to keep your questions brief. Please refrain from speeches. We're long past the days of denying the existence of climate change. Each year, the Earth's temperature increases, as does the attention given to the issue. Regardless of shifting optimism on climate change, opinions have consistently called for policy changes to mediate the problem in order to bring about tangible public benefits. Tonight, we'll hear from Professor Michael Hume, a recognized environmental expert who challenges the popular view of the human role in remedying the climate system. Here to introduce this evening's special guest is Professor Simon Dalby. He's the CIGI Chair in the Political Economy of Climate Change at the Balsley School of International Affairs and a Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. He'll be joining our featured speaker on stage following the lecture to talk further about the issue and moderate questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Simon Dalby.
Thanks, Fred, and welcome one and all. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Hume to you tonight. He really does have the distinguished career that people usually introduce speakers as having. In this case, it is not false advertising. He has had a long and distinguished career indeed. BSc from Durham University, PhD from Swansea, both of those degrees in the discipline of geography, and he went on to start his career at the University of Salford, lecturer there for a few years, before moving on to where, he's best known, which is at the University of East Anglia, where he started in 1988. He's involved with the Climatic Research Unit there and became the founding director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK at that institution. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal papers, 3 books, many book chapters, and lots of reports and popular articles. He really is a very well-published author indeed. He wrote a climate column for the Guardian newspaper in Britain for about a dozen years. So he's not only a scientist and a climate researcher, but also is used to dealing with journalism and is a published journalist too. He co-edited the journal Global Environmental Change, and most recently, he has become the editor-in-chief of Wiley's Interdisciplinary Reviews of Climate Change, a journal which was launched in 2010, just after he published the book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And here comes the plug, copies of which are available outside after the lecture, which Mike has agreed to sign for you. It's the closest thing in this field, probably, to an academic bestseller. It is been a book that has been far more successful at getting attention from academic and popular audiences. So in that sense, he's not only a scientist, a journalist, he's also a best-selling author. He has led research projects including ADAM, the Adaptation and Mitigation Strategies for European Union. He has been involved in preparing climate scenarios and reports for the British government and for the European Commission, UNEP, and various other international bodies, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where he was the coordinating lead author for the chapter on climate scenario development for the 3rd assessment report, and has had a number of different additional affiliations with that institution. Very recently, he moved from the University of East Anglia, and he's now Professor of Climate and Culture in the Department of Geography at the School of Social Science and Public Policy at King's College in London. He says that his work explores the idea of climate change using historical, cultural, and scientific analyses, seeking to illuminate the numerous ways in which climate change is deployed in public and political discourse. Hence, he's the perfect person to address the lecture with tonight's title of The Public Life of Climate Change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Hume.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much for CG for inviting me here for a few days, here today for this lecture tonight, and then over the next couple of days for a workshop that Simon and his colleague Dan Scott have organised here in Waterloo. Wherever I go, of course, there are always resonances or traces or echoes of our British imperial past. I'd never at all associated the combination of Kitchener and Waterloo with two rather significant, well, one significant person and one significant event in British imperial history until I discovered that over our dinner earlier this evening. I'm going to talk about what I call the public life of climate change, the first 25 years of it. But I'm going to start off with some headlines that came out a few weeks ago as the IPCC, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued the first section of its fifth assessment report. This was back just at the very end of September. And these were the sort of comments, headline comments that circulated after that publication. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Human influence in the climate system is clear. Continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming of the climate system. Clear, short, sharp statements coming from this body of climate scientists. I want to juxtapose that with a headline from the Guardian newspaper. Here, front page, UN's vast report will end the scientific argument. Now will the world act? But I juxtaposed those two because that headline did not follow from those headline statements from the IPCC. Actually, that headline from The Guardian was from 2007, just after the fourth assessment report of the IPCC had been published, claiming then that the end of scientific argument will lead to global action on climate change. And, of course, the obvious point is that it hasn't. And actually what The Guardian is revealing there in its 2007... No? Is it gone? What The Guardian was revealing in its headline was a very particular understanding of the relationship between knowledge and politics, between science and policy, what we might call the linear model. That knowledge leads to action. I'm going to come back and say something about that in a minute or two. But things around climate change are not as simple as this. And indeed, the focus of my book, which Simon mentioned before, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, is exactly to explore why that connection between knowledge and policy is not as straightforward as those Guardian headline writers may have wanted it to be. And explore in the book the many different reasons, legitimate reasons, I claim, why we disagree about what climate change means for us and also about what climate change means for political action in the world. But just published a few weeks ago is this book, Exploring Climate Change Through Science and in Society. This is a collection of many of my shorter popular essays and articles and speeches over the last 25 years, combined with 3 new essays that I've just written, one of which has been the inspiration for the talk this evening, in which I look at this 25-year period since 1988 and to explore how it is that climate change over that 25-year period has changed scientifically, politically, and culturally. And so my story then begins 25 years ago, and it begins on the evening of the 27th of September 1988 in central London, the annual dinner of the Royal Society, the oldest scientific society in the world, and Margaret Thatcher, then Prime Minister of Britain, delivered a speech in the Fishmongers' Hall in central London to the Royal Society, in which she drew attention to not only the role that British scientists had played in environmental science, but in particular their contribution to understanding the contributions that humans were making to the greenhouse effect. That actually was the language, of course, that was used 25 years ago. So we can see nomenclature has changed. The greenhouse effect was the preferred terminology that was talked about 25 years ago. She praised British scientists, but she warned in this speech of a global heat trap which could lead to climatic instability, and referred to the possibility that we have unwittingly begun a massive experiment with the system of this planet itself. And this speech I use as the moment of the coming out, if you like, of climate change. Here, the most significant political leader thus far to draw attention to the political and policy significance of this idea of human-induced climate change. And so the following day, headlines in the UK media, The Guardian, cautious greeting to Thatcher's greening. The Times newspaper, Thatcher gives support to the war on pollution. Again, interestingly, that metaphor, that military metaphor, the war on pollution, was being coined 25 years ago. And even the science journal Nature asked the question in their editorial the following week: has Mrs. Thatcher turned green? The journal, in fact, answered no to that question in their editorial, but it did welcome the attention, the additional attention, that her speech would bring to what they called this potentially serious problem. So 25 years ago, this was, as I say, the moment I claim that the public life of climate change commenced. It also coincided with that summer, that greenhouse summer of 1988 in the United States, that saw Jim Hansen, give testimony to the US Senate in Washington, and made the famous claim that it is time to stop waffling so much and say that the evidence is pretty strong that the greenhouse effect is here. And this hearing took place as drought and 100-degree Fahrenheit temperatures spread across the American Midwest. It was very widely reported across American media. And so by the end of the year, we could have Time magazine adopting Earth as its planet of the year. So the greenhouse effect now became this topic, not just of scientific deliberation and research, but now an object of public and political conversation, certainly in the Western world in the late 1980s. And at this moment, the late 80s, the early 1990s, it's very important to understand events that were occurring internationally, geopolitical events that were occurring internationally. Two in particular I draw attention to. One was that the recent signing of the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances, 1987, had led to this rise of a sense that these types of global environmental problems could be attended to satisfactorily through the sort of multilateralism that the United Nations gave a platform for. And many of the institutions and procedures and processes that had been successful with the Montreal Protocol were imported into this new thinking about how climate change could best be attended to. But the other important thing as well at this time was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of apartheid, if you like, in Germany, the end of the Cold War, and this sense of a new moment, a new international world order, a sense in which the bipolar world of the last 50 years had now disappeared, and this new sense of optimism that actually these types of global problems like climate change could genuinely be attended to through global regulatory frameworks. And these two events in this period were very significant in establishing what, and I'm borrowing here from my colleague Dan Sarowitz at Arizona State University, what Dan Sarowitz has called the plan with regard to climate change. And for Sarowitz, there are two components that he argues were central to this emerging plan. First of all, that knowledge leads to action. Science drives policy. And we've seen an example of that in that Guardian headline that I showed from 2007. But his second component part of the plan was that the action that would surely follow was a multilateralism in which emissions reductions driven by a targets and timetables approach agreed to by the significant nations of the world would be the way in which the risks of human-induced climate change would be regulated. And I should also say another component part of the first component of this plan, knowledge leads to action, the assumption very quickly became lodged in the IPCC, this United Nations process for bringing knowledge to bear on climate change, was that consensual knowledge will lead more effectively and decisively to political action. And the IPCC, over its 25-year period, has driven very powerfully, of course, for these consensus-like statements. So this is the plan that emerged in the early 1990s for dealing with climate change. It led to, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol being agreed at the fifth meeting of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol, in which the industrialized countries agreed to take on binding emissions reduction targets by the period 2008 to 2012. And the Kyoto Protocol allowed these so-called flexible mechanisms to ensure the greatest chance of success of attaining those targets. So emissions trading was introduced, certainly in the European Union, and this notion of the clean development mechanism, whereby industrialized countries could invest in projects in developing countries and claim the credits for the hypothetical emissions that had thereby been offset. But the withdrawal from the United States from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001 under the Bush Junior administration was a major setback for this plan of dealing with climate change. And so what one found is that new voices, new interlocutors entered the stage. So we had Hollywood come into action in 2004 with their movie The Day After Tomorrow. A blockbuster, box office takings, record high. But actually what was found through survey work of cinemagoers after seeing that film, contrary to what many of the environmental campaigning organizations had hoped for beforehand, was that actually the movie was just as likely to induce apathy as activism amongst those who had seen it. Perhaps more interesting was Al Gore's intervention in 2006 with his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Again, great acclaim in different parts of the world to this movie. And unlike The Day After Tomorrow, of course, Gore's film spawned this ongoing transnational movement, which continues to the present day, to spread the message, as he put it at the end of his film, that small actions by billions of people will help to solve our climate crisis. also around this period, in a way to bolster the chances of the plan succeeding, we found the introduction of the metaphor of tipping points being introduced into climate science. It was first used in a scientific paper dealing with climate change in 2005, but very rapidly it gained currency in both advocacy and in political circles. Jim Hansen was very prominent in giving public profile to the tipping point metaphor. New arts movements emerged. This one, the tipping point in the UK, energizing the creative response to climate change, picked up on its usage. And within 12 months of it first appearing in a peer-reviewed science paper, the tipping point was taken up by Tony Blair in his 2006 speech, when he warned that the world had only 10 more years to avoid crossing catastrophic tipping points. So this powerful metaphor gave an extra impetus to the urgency and the desire for the plan to succeed. It was helped along the way by the Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change, which came out from the British government in the back end also of 2006. And around the time that the fourth assessment report of the IPCC was published in 2007, it was as though actually the key elements of the plan were now coming together in a powerful way. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the IPCC jointly with Al Gore for his movie An Inconvenient Truth. And the sense was that leading up to the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties at Copenhagen in 2009, that actually all of the key elements were in place for the plan to deliver decisively on what, again, campaigners were calling a fair, ambitious, and binding deal, a FAB deal, that would bring the plan to fruition. But then, of course, we saw the crash, not the financial crash, but the crash that led to the demise of the plan. It was helped, the demise along its way, by the leaked emails from my university in the back end of November 2009, which questioned the virtue of climate scientists, if not actually questioned the veracity of some of the data that was underlying some of the claims of the IPCC. The IPCC itself came under criticism a few weeks later for the mistake about the Himalayan glaciers and one or two other half-truths. But actually central to this was the performance at COP15 in Copenhagen of the world's major powers. And it showed the brutal reality, brutal for those at least who were hoping for a FAB deal, that national interests, particularly amongst the most powerful countries in the world, were always going to trump the aspirations and ambitions of those who are campaigning for the plan. Copenhagen was a failure in many respects, and if you like, the evidence that the plan reached its apogee in that moment before Copenhagen could be found in this graph here. This is from my colleague Max Boykoff at the University of Colorado. So here just plotting the coverage here in the major Canadian print newspapers back from 2000 through to 2013 of the coverage of climate change stories. And you can see the peak attention around 2006 and 2007, the great attention around Copenhagen and ClimateGate back in 2009, and then the dissipating interest, the disappearing interest of these major print media to follow the story of climate change. And that sort of shape, Boykoff has found that characteristic across virtually all world regions over this 10 or 15-year period. So there we have it, the rise of the plan and the fall, the demise of the plan. But also paralleling that potted account that I've just given, right the way from the very beginning, there have been challenges to the plan. The plan has actually not gone along uncontested and unopposed. And one of the very earliest challenges to the plan, to the credibility of the very first IPCC assessment, came from perhaps a rather unexpected source, from Greenpeace. In the summer of 1990, just as the final assessments of the IPCC were being published, Greenpeace itself published their own report on climate change. This book, edited by Jerry Leggett, Global Warming, the Greenpeace Report. And in it, Leggett accused the IPCC of failing in its responsibilities, refusing to listen to warnings from its scientists. Leggett describes, this then, referring to his Greenpeace report, this then is the book which says what the IPCC should have said about how we must respond to the greenhouse threat. Very interesting to read back now from the perspective 23 years on of seeing how Greenpeace was engaging with the IPCC assessments. And two things particularly interested me in rereading Leggett's introduction here. First of all, was the way in which Greenpeace saw that the correct response to global warming emerged directly and unambiguously from scientific evidence. Again, the linear model in operation. According to Greenpeace, there's only one way to interpret and act on that evidence. It's to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through an immediate radical program of energy efficiency, energy innovation, and technology transfer funded through a tax on armaments. Itself, of course, a very particular policy proposal at that moment of Cold War dissolution. But the second interesting thing about Greenpeace's challenge to the IPCC back in 1990 was that it itself foreshadowed a much later challenge to the fourth assessment report of the IPCC from the Heartland Institute. 18 years later, just after the fourth assessment, the Heartland Institute, the libertarian free market think tank based in Chicago, published its own response, just like Greenpeace did, its own response to the IPCC, the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change. Another challenge to the plan also emerged early on, in the early 1990s. Two Indian analysts, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narain, confronted the framing of climate change through Sarowitz's plan. In their influential pamphlet, Global Warming in an Unequal World, they argued that actually central to climate change were questions of equity and justice. One could not treat molecules of CO2 coming out of gas-guzzling tailpipes in North America in the same way that one can treat molecules of CO2 coming out of indoor stoves in India. These molecules may have the same physical properties and may have the same physical power in the world, but those molecules of CO2 had very different moral valences. And so here the seeds of the climate justice movement were sown right at the very beginning of this period. Of course, attacks on the credibility of the IPCC and on the claims of certain climate scientists have continued in different tones and at different speeds and places over this period of time. One can draw attention here, for example, front cover of the New Scientist magazine in 1997, The Greenhouse Wars, drawing attention to arguments about the veracity of climate models. Pat Michaels here was quoted, "They can't go on forever tinkering with their models, trying to make them fit reality. Ever heard of Occam's razor? It says the simple explanation is usually the best." Apply that here, and you'll conclude that climate is just not as sensitive to the greenhouse effect as they predicted. Or equally more recently, we could draw attention to the new climate change auditors, if you will, the new social bloggers, the users of media, internet media, to audit and scrutinize the claims of climate scientists and policy analysts. Here, Bishop Hill, very prominent in the UK, climate audit here in Canada, of course, also equally prominent. But some of these have been very challenging to the establishment and the orthodoxies of the plan. And then a final example of how this plan has actually not survived through these 25 years unchallenged and uncontested was that by the beginning of this present century, not only had the US withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol, but actually we were seeing further changes in the global world order that may not have been predicted back in 1988. The center of world economic activity began to move east and south. Large economies, such as the BRIC nations, saw their emissions of greenhouse gases beginning to rise and actually accelerate, just at a period when, ostensibly, the plan through the Kyoto Protocol was trying to rein in these emissions. And so over this period of time, one has actually seen the emissions of greenhouse gases, here in this case carbon dioxide, increase, accelerate through this period. The only blip in that curve was nothing to do with climate policy. The blip was caused by the financial and economic crisis in 2009. And so the multilateral framework, the division of the world into developed and developing, Annex I countries and non-Annex I countries, that may have seemed to make sense back in 1992, began to look increasingly anachronistic, given the burgeoning growth in many of these southern and eastern economies. And so because of this acceleration in greenhouse gas emissions, and because of the difficulties of seeing that the Kyoto Protocol was in any way an adequate response to the challenges, then a plan B began to take shape during the last decade. And this plan B is the idea that if the plan isn't going to work, if the world's nation states, through multilateralism, aren't going to rein in greenhouse gas emissions, then actually the world scientists need to take matters directly into their own hands. And so we now have the narrative, the discourse, the imagination of creating a thermostat for the planet. Mirrors in space, aerosols in the stratosphere, a thermostat that can be turned in order to deliver a global temperature according to human will. This is indeed a significant challenge to the conventional plan of dealing with climate change, and it remains, of course, an open question as we move into the future to see how far these arguments that actually such technologies could deliver such a thermostat will indeed be either developed, and certainly whether indeed they will ever be deployed or not. So back in 1988, 25 years ago, there were very few serious commentators that actually believed that the politics of climate change would be anything other than difficult. You can read a lot of the accounts at the time, and people realized that climate change was indeed a deeply difficult and troubling political conundrum. But nevertheless, the plan and the various institutions and processes that built up around it held together the assumption that, at least in principle, human-induced climate change could be attended to through these types of policy interventions. The belief has been maintained that these forms of policy intervention would yield tangible benefits. But what I think we have to ask ourselves now, maybe with the benefit of 25 years of learning, observing and studying and learning what has been tried and what has failed, is whether actually humanity is capable of controlling climate, is capable of eradicating its most potent and powerful influences on the climate system. And again, I come back to my book, Why We Disagree. If we attend and listen carefully to the reasons why people disagree about how serious the risks are and about how to deal with those risks, then maybe we reach a conclusion that the climate system cannot be managed by humans. On the other hand, what has also emerged, and again, simple empirical observation of how this idea of climate change has taken hold across all of our cultures, virtually all of our cultures around the world, is that there is a tremendous amount now of new creative, emotional, aesthetic, and spiritual reflection and engagement with this idea of climate change. This cultural engagement is very evident if you simply follow or monitor the sort of books that are being published on climate change. Typically, back in 1988, I would estimate maybe one book per week was published on climate change in the English language. About 50 books were published in 1988. Now it's more than a book a day is being published on different aspects of climate change. It's reached into all areas of human cultural life: gender, violence, literature, security, architecture, the imagination, football, tourism, spirituality, masculinity, ethics, climate for dummies, climate for philosophers. It's as though all human practices, all human arguments and disputes now have to be expressed in the language of climate change. Like a kaleidoscope, climate change now gets refracted and portrayed in various forms of creative art. Here, cartoons, this competition from a couple of years ago, to find ways of capturing the idea of climate change in cartoons, or in photography, in poetry, in music, in literature, in theatre and dance, in religious practice, in architecture, in educational curricula. Climate change is everywhere. It has reached into all of our cultural life. And so our political disputes, whether local or international, whether they're disputes about landscape aesthetics, about child rearing, trade tariffs, theology, patents, extreme weather, justice, taxation, even democracy itself, find themselves caught up in the arguments and linguistic expressions of climate change. We indeed are now living in the era of climate change. And so new cultural interpretations and subversions of the idea of climate change also we can find. I just draw attention to one here. Diesel, the Italian clothing company, back in 2007, launched their new designer clothing wear with the provocative advertising campaign Global Warming Ready, subverting the prevalent and instinctive awareness of the idea of climate change, but now subverting it for humour, fatalizing, distancing, cynicizing almost. Diesel is showing that people don't need to worry about global warming, because when it happens, everyone will be having fun and looking sexy. So how do I finish this account of the public life of climate change over 25 years? Well, I want to finish on a very short account of suggesting a rather more pragmatic way of thinking about climate change and thinking of it particularly in policy terms. This is something that a number of us in a very loose network over the last few years have tried to piece together. We call it climate pragmatism. It's partly connected with the Breakthrough Institute in the United States. It also has been coalesced around the Hartwell group and the Hartwell papers that have been published. What we're trying to do here is to recognize that the plan has failed, and we need to face up to that reality. But also to recognize that there is no single way of framing climate change in policy terms. And that our approach is to break down the constituent elements of the meta problem and recognize that these smaller, fragmented pieces of the problem can actually be dealt with in different ways by different coalitions of actors. And I won't elaborate greatly on this, but I just want to give a flavor of what that means by saying that the idea that adaptation to weather risks should be seen as a public good. It actually doesn't matter primarily which part of the heat wave was caused by human emissions of greenhouse gases and which part of the heat wave was natural. People still die from heat waves. People still die from heavy rainfall and from cyclones. Actually, the first and foremost importance is to increase the ability of humans and the things that they value to be protected and made secure in the face of weather dangers and weather risks. That is adaptation, which is an agenda and a policy program in its own right. It doesn't have to be entangled with all of the other dimensions of the problem. Secondly, to recognize that it's not just CO2 coming out of fossil burning that is the way in which humans influence the climate system. That, roughly speaking, is only about half of the forcing of humans on the climate system. There are a range of short-term, for example, short-term climate forcing agents or other forcing ways that can be attended to more forensically, more precisely, without necessarily having to solve the big energy transition problem. So black carbon, probably now the second most important forcing agent of humans on the climate system. Black carbon can be attended to. And in the process of attending to black carbon, you bring about a tremendous public welfare benefit, saving 1.5 million lives per year. Methane, short-lived greenhouse gas, can be attended to by different types of policy instruments than a targets and timetables approach for eliminating CO2 emissions. Or the halocarbons. The halocarbons have recently been taken out of the Kyoto UNFCCC process and put into the Montreal Protocol, a protocol that has been working, more or less, pretty successfully. And actually now one of the global warming families of gases has been placed under regulatory management of the Kyoto Protocol. So there are different ways of attending to different elements of the problem. And yet in the end, there will need to be an energy transition, for sure. Fossil energy, we need to move away from a reliance on fossil energy, and that is going to require large-scale energy innovation. It's not going to be achieved by windmills and solar tiles on people's roofs. The huge, huge unmet demand for electricity in the world, from the nearly 2 billion people who don't have grid connectivity today, plus another 1 or 2 billion people who are going to arrive on the planet in the next 40 years. Meeting that electricity demand is a matter of human dignity, we would argue. And it can only be met by technologies that can undercut oil, coal and gas in terms of their competitiveness. And that is going to require an innovation program, and that, we argue, has to be led primarily through the public purse. So my point to end is not to be negative or to be cynical or to be despairing about the story I've told. It is to recognize what has happened over 25 years and to learn from that and to find new ways of trying to attend to the risks and dangers that climate change presents to us. And some of these arguments, one can see them evolve over the years in the collection of articles and essays and speeches that I've given and many of which I've brought together in this new book, which, although it's not here today, it should be now available from the publishers in good bookshops and, of course, through Amazon. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Anybody who's standing at the microphones. But while I'm waiting for people to get to the microphones, I cannot help but reflect on how you started your talk and ask the hypothetical question of 25 years later, given what you have said about the things that need to be done, what would Margaret Thatcher say to you in terms of how the public life has evolved since she made her speech?
Yeah, well, that's a nice hypothetical question to give a hypothetical answer to. Margaret Thatcher died a few months ago. I think it's interesting to think about why did Thatcher engage with this scientific phenomenon back in 1988 when, yes, there was an increasing amount of scientific activity around it and some of the campaigning was beginning in the environmental movement, but it certainly wasn't mainstream. But Thatcher took it, I think, partly because her sense of being a scientist, she was trained as a chemist, and a sense that she could get to grips with what the issues were around the greenhouse effect and how humans were changing it. But I think also, as all good politicians do, they look for opportunity, political opportunity. And for Thatcher, I think the opportunity was around leadership. I think there was a sense that the world was changing in those late 1980s, and maybe this was another way in which she would be able to demonstrate international leadership at the demise of the Cold War. It also, of course, helped her program of running down the coal industry in Britain. So great political opportunism. But again, that tells us something important as well about climate change, that people will use climate change in order to pursue their own interests. And there's nothing particularly surprising or shocking about that. I mean, that's what people do. That's what politics is all about. People pursuing their interests. And Thatcher was doing that back in 1988.
Do we have a question? We do.
Good evening. My name is Robert McClellan. I live here in Waterloo and I work at Victoria University. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the whole Glaciergate period around 2009, because I remember seeing your voice, or hearing your voice and seeing your quotes in the newspaper as sort of being the voice of reason during a lot of that debate. We got sort of bits and pieces of it here, so I think cherry-picked parts of the debate. Could you just sort of, now that with the benefit of hindsight, tell us what really came out of that and what lessons we could take from it going forward?
Yes, I mean, I take your comment about being the voice of reason as a compliment.
It is.
Although that same terminology has been used by certain climate critics to say that Hume, of course, always offers the voice of reason, but actually, of course, he was part of the conspiracy, and he was part of the reasons why it all went so badly wrong. I actually do reflect on that whole very question about ClimateGate and Glaciergate, in the new book that's just come out with a new essay, just thinking back over the last 3 or 4 years, what has changed and what have we learned? Both what has climate science learned as a consequence, but I think also what have we learned about the relationship between science and its citizens? And what seemed to me central to the whole ClimateGate issue was a question of trust between science and citizen. And most of the issues, most of the accusations that were levied at myself, but not particularly at myself, but it was mostly some of my other colleagues, I don't think in the end they actually carried a tremendous amount of weight substantively, although I think one issue that did, and most definitely did, was a warranted criticism, which was the closing off of certain climate scientists from sharing data with other scientists. I think that, for me, was the single most damning part of the whole episode. And that itself told us something about, I think, this sort of deep polarization that had affected and afflicted parts of the scientific community, that there's a sense of us against them. If you're not for us, you're against us. But I think trust is key. And I think one of the interesting things that has happened in the last 3 or 4 years is the much greater willingness of a lot of climate scientists to engage in multiple fora, social media, public discussions, much more explicit discussions about uncertainty. And I think that's a positive to have come out of the whole ClimateGate episode.
Thank you.
We have a question from an online viewer, and I'll read it for the audience here. At times it feels like the general public is waiting for policy changes to deal with climate change on their behalf. How can we re-engage ground-up action on climate change? And that comes from Ben in Waterloo. Mike?
Well, Ben, from Waterloo, you're not too far away from here. I think your question suggests, or at least maybe your question doesn't suggest, but let me suggest, that of course there are different ways of thinking about where responsibility for attending to climate risks lies. Is it actually what Al Gore's campaign was arguing, that what was the small actions by billions of people can actually make a difference? Or actually, is it a small number of actions by a relatively small number of political leaders that can make a big difference? There are different ways in which you could argue, actually, whether it actually is small actions by lots of people or big actions by a small number of people. I think, in a way, neither of those is an adequate reading of the problem, which I think is a much larger problem. It's structural. It actually is. So structural in the sense that, you know, our economies, our very sort of practices, social practices of living, our material consumption practices are deeply connected in an infrastructure that is implicated with fossil fuels. But even our very human sense of what the future holds is a structural problem. I mean, where is a planet with 7 going on 9 billion people actually heading? What levels of material consumption? What levels of mobility? What levels of fertility do we actually think are appropriate and sustainable on this planet? I think actually climate change, and this again is why I think culturally climate change has reached and penetrated into so many different parts of human thinking and creative life, is that the very ideas behind climate change, that humans are an agent of change on a planetary scale, really asks very deep questions about how we think of ourselves, how we think of our responsibilities, but how we think of the future. So I don't actually think it's either even just, it's not just political leaders, and it's not just small actions by billions of people. I really think climate change asks awkward and challenging questions about how we see the future unfolding as a collective of humanity on this planet. And to that, there is no one right answer, of course.
Thanks. We have another question.
Hi, my name is Byron Willison. I teach philosophy at Wilfrid Laurier University. It was a great talk, by the way. But I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on a quote that you put up there, which was one of the principal conclusions of your book, namely that we should stop thinking that we can manage climate change or manage the climate problem. I think in the book, actually, I think you talk a lot about our need to stop thinking of climate change at all as a problem that can be solved. I wonder how radical you take that claim to be. On its face, it sounds fairly radical. On its face as well, it strikes me as being somewhat incompatible with climate pragmatism, as you at least sketched it for us. Because I think, generally speaking, what pragmatism is an attempt to manage a state of affairs, whatever that state of affairs happens to be. So do you, qua pragmatist, want to abandon the notion of climate management altogether? That would be the radical conclusion. Or is it just management of a less ambitious scope than perhaps geoengineering or the plan, right, the FAB plan?
Okay, so I think how I would answer that question is to take attention away from managing climate change as being the objective of public policy intervention, and to recognize that the sorts of areas of public policy intervention that are more tractable and manageable and likely to deliver are going to be smaller in scale and more limited in scope. But they're attending to particular welfare bads, environmental bads, social bads. But it's not climate change that is the focal point. So, and I do this thought experiment. If we really thought that it was climate change that was the problem, and I often quote Monbiot's phrase from a few years ago when he said, George Monbiot, public columnist, liberal public columnist in Britain, if we fail with climate change, we fail in every other project, is what he said. And I disagree with that. I don't think climate change is the ultimate objective of whether you want to call yourself a progressive or a conservative or just someone who actually is concerned about public welfare or ecosystem, ecological welfare. Climate change isn't the problem. Because if it was the problem, then we would be putting mirrors in space. If we really wanted to stop climate change at 2 degrees, we could do that pretty simply in terms of technology and economics. And we could actually stabilize temperature more or less globally at 2 degrees. But how many people would actually think the problem of climate change had been solved if that happened? So, and this is what I mean, we need to get beyond climate change. There's other things that are concerning us. And so the pragmatism line of thinking is to say, let's take the attention away from climate change and attend to many of the other social, environmental bads. And in the process of attending to those, then actually we do find that human influence in the climate system will be lessened. It won't be eradicated, but it will be lessened. So eradicating black carbon saves up 1.5 million people's lives, a great burden on public health care, and at the same time, it eliminates about 8% of the forcing of humans on the climate system. So that is a pragmatic way of doing policy. But it isn't about stopping climate change from happening or solving the climate change problem. The other analogy I give to explain climate pragmatism is to say that there are not many health ministries around the world that set out an agenda that says that public health policy in this country is going to deliver 10 extra years of life expectancy in the next 25 years. That isn't the driving policy goal of most health ministries. What most health ministries are actually targeted on much smaller areas of public health intervention, which is maybe about primary healthcare interventions or around cancer treatments or about inoculation rates, which, when you combine all those together, will bring about a population increase in life expectancy. But that's not the top-down driver of public health policy. It's a more bottom-up, fragmented set of policy interventions.
We have another question over here.
Hi there, thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Rahul, and I'm coming from the University of Waterloo in my master's in urban planning. I have some of my colleagues here today, actually, and we are collectively having a university-sanctioned delegation to the COP19 conference in Warsaw in a few weeks, actually. And we've been trying to figure out over the past few weeks and months really what kind of impact we can have in terms of education and understanding the policy, but also seeing somewhat of a decline in progress at these discussions, what impact or what results can actually come out of this conference. So I guess broadly I'm trying to understand, is the United Nations seeing a decline in relevance, and is that going to change in the future? And I guess broadly on the other side of the coin, is the current system of nations and policy decision making, is it really possible for nations to come to an agreement with the changes you're seeing east to west and the growth of technology? Is it possible for the UN versus kind of today nations to come to an agreement for positive action? Thank you.
Well, I mean, hopefully you picked up enough from my lecture to suggest what my answer to that would be. On the other hand, I would say that I suspect that there is nevertheless continuing value in having these annual meetings, these conferences of the parties, that gather different voices, not just national political voices, but voices such as yours, various other civic interests and business interests, that actually almost as an ideas fair of people, shouting and demonstrating and proposing different perspectives and different ideas or suggestions. I think in that sense that almost certainly is value in providing these venues when large numbers of people and interests can meet together. But in terms of thinking that COP19 in Warsaw or COP21 in Paris in 2 years' time is somehow going to provide the decisive breakthrough, the fab deal that Copenhagen talked about, or in Paris in 2 years' time, basically the dial has been reset, and so now it's going to be in 2015. The nations will agree to start on a process of 5 years of negotiation leading to a deal that will kick in 2020. Well, come on, how many people actually seriously think that's going to happen? I don't, because I just don't think that type of coercive, deep multilateralism is the way in which the world of politics works. So I applaud your going, and I hope you do bring ideas into that melting pot of ideas and sharing and exchange, and I'm sure there's benefit in that. But I'm not holding my breath that there's a deal waiting to be struck either in Warsaw or in Paris.
Thank you.
It's not quite a follow-on from that question, but it's fairly close. David in Ottawa is writing to ask, why does the fact that climate change is now everywhere rule out the possibility of a comprehensive strategy to attend to it? This was surely also the case with slavery and civil rights achievements.
Yes, thank you, David. Certainly that comparison with slavery is sometimes made with climate change. Certainly this focus on, for example, eradicating fossil energy out of the world system, being somehow equivalent to eradicating slavery out of the world's social system. But I think the reason I say why I'm not a believer in a comprehensive strategy to attend to climate change is because I just think that we collectively, 7 billion people on the planet, 193 countries, 6,000 languages, we simply are too heterogeneous and diverse in the way in which we think about life and its attendant risks and the way we organise ourselves politically. It's what would be called, again, we talked about pragmatism as a particular political philosophy. I mean, another part of philosophical thought is around the idea of pluralism and actually embracing and recognising pluralism and dissensus as being much more faithful to the human experience than the ideas of comprehensive strategies, universalism, and consensus. And I certainly, in that sense, I'm a pluralist in the sense that I think we will always disagree about the range of things that climate change engages with, which I, again, summarize in my book. It's around our religious beliefs. It's around our ethical values. It's around the sort of knowledge that we think carries authority in society. It's around forms of political organization. It's around what we actually would describe as the good life. It's around the very simple thing about how we attend to different and interpret different risks. These are things that divide us. And to think that somehow we can devise a comprehensive strategy that will put all those pieces together and get the world moving in one direction, I think is unrealistic. So that pluralism and dissensus and pragmatism is not a passive philosophy. It is nevertheless still an active philosophy, but it's working with diversity and difference and pluralism, and yet still finding things that can be done and enacted in the world to bring about public welfare or to eradicate environmental bads. So I don't think a comprehensive strategy is attainable for something like climate change, which I would suggest is actually not, I don't think it is comparable with slavery, although I think that comparison would probably require another good half hour to discuss, which we probably haven't got time for.
With another question over here, please.
Yes, David Wachter, Kitchener. Since your theme is the past 25 years, I wonder if you could clarify what has happened in the past 25 years in terms of the rate of average global temperature rise. Has it stayed the same? Has there been a hiatus? What's been going on over that period? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the numbers to say. I mean, if one looks at, you know, if you fit a linear trend, my guess would be if you fit a linear trend through the global temperature curve since 1988, you've probably got a warming rate of somewhere around about 0.1 degree per decade, my guess would be, over that 25-year period. If, on the other hand, let's say you break it into two periods, 1988 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2013, you'll actually probably find two rather different trends, probably something like 0.15 degrees per decade in the first part and 0.05 degrees per decade in the second, or even less than that. So yes, there have been changes in the rate of warming for sure, and that is actually something, of course, that's been very heavily debated, and I think in very constructive ways on some of these new social media sites that have proliferated in the last 3 or 4 years. I think the interesting thing about focus on global temperature is that what climate scientists have been tending to do in the last couple of years is to reframe the science of climate change away from global temperature, which has always been the iconic indicator for policy and public discourse, into talking about global heating. So it's a reframing of climate science that has actually been happening. So the argument is that even if over the last 10 or 15 years the rate of global temperature warming has stalled, heat is still accumulating in the planetary system, in the deep ocean, in the shallow ocean, in the melting of ice, and so on. And I can understand why, from a scientific point of view, that's an important and maybe a necessary move to make. But it throws a big problem into the world of communication and policy. People, citizens and politicians who have been tuned to thinking in terms of global temperature as the decisive, iconic index, now being told, well, it's not actually global temperature that matters, it really is the accumulating heat in the planet. That actually, psychologically, is a very difficult thing to suddenly start to re-educate the world about. So I do think in that sense, and I heard echoes of this very much in the last month or so from commentators from within the IPCC reporting on the fifth assessment report, it's a difficult thing to communicate effectively, given how focused the discussion has been on global temperature. And also what it shows, is that we probably know rather less about all of the feedback processes within the climate system than we might like to have thought we knew a few years ago. When I'm saying we, who's the we? I'm no longer a practicing climate scientist, so I'm not sure whether I should include myself in that we or not.
Another question.
Hello, I'm Thomas Valley from University of Toronto, and you mentioned the idea of climate change becoming popular, and that might be a negative issue. I understand from a political point of view, sound bites. Obviously, Tony Blair loves sound bites, but isn't it a good thing that the term or the notion of climate change has been adopted by artists, philosophers, and so on, and it's kind of in the public's hand now, and what they do about it and how we approach it are two different, so do you agree that it might be a good thing that's in the public and more awareness of it is out there?
Yes, no, I do absolutely agree. I think it is a very good thing that this idea of climate change has reached across and into cultural and political spaces around the world. Because what the idea of climate change is doing, however you argue about the precise attribution and however you argue about the precise forms of policy intervention, what the idea of climate change is doing is drawing attention to something very, very important in the unfolding story of humanity on this planet, which is that our collective impact on physical processes is operating at a scale that has never operated before. And so what it draws attention to is this the impossibility of retaining these clear lines between nature and culture, between the physical and the social. And I think that, for me, is actually a very important lesson that climate change reveals. And I think, again, this is why so much cultural work around climate change is so fruitful, because it is attending to something very, very important, is how we see these boundaries between nature and culture, physical and social. So however one resolves or deals with the argumentative dimensions of climate change, I think it is drawing attention to something very, very important and powerful. And it's happening in all parts of the world. And I think that's a good thing. And it means that actually, I've been talking about the last 25 years. I'm sure someone probably wants to ask the question, so what in 25 years' time will have happened? If we're sitting in this room in 2038, what would somebody be saying? I don't want a crystal ball, but I'm sure that this idea of climate change is not going to go away, because it's part of a larger story of how humans collectively are transforming and being transformed by these physical attachments that we have to our cultural life.
Hi, I'm Chris Walter from a company called GlobeScan. Thank you for the conversation. I've got about 19 questions, and I'll try and get to one. Maybe I'll slip into two. One is, in some of the work we've been doing, we do a lot of public opinion polling over the last 15 years, tracking worldviews on issues, and one is climate change. And about 3 years ago, we noticed, maybe 4 years ago, a flip between greater concern in the global south compared to the global north, and historically it's always been the reverse. So the urgency on climate change was felt much more in the southern hemispheres than the northern hemisphere, and I'm just curious your views on what the implications of that are. Because I think what's happening in many countries like China and parts of Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America is a much more pragmatic perspective on the economic realities of extreme weather events and restrictions on water and all these different food security and energy issues that are kind of intertwined in the climate change agenda. And that leads to me, I think, to a much more, I guess, simpler and more accessible hook for people, because it's about economic development, which is the central narrative in developing economies. I mean, is that how you feel? And then the last part of this, and also broadly, is how does emotion play into this? When we look at the plan historically, and the idea of knowledge to policy, that seems very cold and sterile, and now we're, as you said, a flourishing explosion of expressions of climate change. In the pragmatic approach you're talking about, the deconstructed view, does emotion still have a role to play in that? Thanks.
Okay, well, there certainly were two different questions there. I think on the first one, yeah, I think that's a very important perspective to draw attention to is how these issues that sort of swirl around climate change, how they get understood and mobilized in southern or tropical countries and nations. And I think actually the narrative of development, whatever we mean by development, then actually takes center stage, which of course in many ways was already pre-shadowed by that intervention back in 1991 by Agarwal and Narain. And that development narrative, of course, though, can play in different directions. You draw attention to one, which is that people are concerned about the impacts of extreme weather and about resource depletions. On the other hand, people are extremely concerned about expansion of energy and the penetration, the reaching of energy into parts of the developing and tropical world where it has not reached yet. And that, of course, suggests the focus of policy is not the same sort of focus as the Sarowitz's plan. Interestingly, I just finished reading a paper that's just been submitted for publication on how climate change is framed in Malaysia. It's not a country I've ever visited. I don't know much about Malaysia. But what the study showed by analysing media representations and policy documents is that in Malaysia, climate change, first and foremost, is seen as an economic opportunity. The framing of climate change is most dominantly in the language of climate capitalism and inducing a national economic growth paradigm. There's very little, so the study found, around vulnerability and hazard of weather extreme. So within that particular political culture, it is about development and finding the right sorts of technologies and energy pathways. It's less about an environmental problem at all. So I do think, we find these different framings of climate change in different parts of the world, which again, coming back to why a comprehensive strategy is going to be very, very difficult, if possible at all, to find, is because of these very different perspectives from around the world. The second question about emotion, what do I say about that? I think knowledge to action. I mean, knowledge to action is a caricature, and of course, this linear model has been heavily discredited by empirical study after empirical study. That's not how knowledge moves within political or policy circles. And actually, the linear model has also been discredited in relation to science communication. So it's not simply a case of educating publics about particular nuggets of scientific truth that come out of laboratories. Actually, the engagement of different publics and citizens with scientific knowledge is much more rich and variegated and allows multiple forms of, call them emotions if you want, but other forms of representation and actually other beliefs and value systems to come into play. I mean, one of the reasons why one finds this polarization, apparent polarization, certainly in Anglophone societies around climate science is, of course, that people filter scientific evidence according to their beliefs. So they look in the rich literature around climate science to find things that are consistent with their cultural priors. And that's a very different model of science communication from the simple transmission route of moving information from this brain to that brain with no contamination or distortion or deviation along the way.
Once upon a time, university professors thought they did that, but we've long since learned better. The next question, please.
Hi there, Keith McManaman from the University of Waterloo. Some of your writings have problematized the process of consensus building in the IPCC as this kind of arc of all the knowledge that there is in the world about climate science. So I wonder, with climate science, the study of climate change sometimes being categorized as a boundary science or a post-normal science, has the IPCC, especially considering the inclusion of a topic like geoengineering for the first time in its most recent report, has it begun to outlive its usefulness?
Well, I was involved very heavily in the third assessment report, which published in 2001. I had a small role in the second assessment report. After finishing the third assessment report in the early 2000s, I deliberately didn't participate in the fourth and haven't in the fifth. And certainly, as the decade of the 2000s continued, I became increasingly convinced that the IPCC was, well, I use the phrase, no longer fit for purpose, that it was an institution that was created at the end of the Cold War era at that moment back in the late 1980s, in a world of the pre-internet, in a world in which there was a very different set of relationships between science and its citizens. The sort of authority that science carried in political circles was very different than it is today. Actually, just about every dimension you can think of in the world has changed quite radically since the IPCC was created. And I mean, one of the things that just convinces me that what I was saying 10 years ago is indeed still the case, that the IPCC has outlived, certainly in the form it exists at the moment, it's outlived its usefulness, is that 6 years of work by Working Group 1, the physical science of climate change, involving, 800 scientists, a tremendous amount of professional time being devoted to this, numerous conferences around the world, a lot of mobility, and to put it bluntly, all that effort has led to the phrase, it is very likely that humans are the dominant cause in the climate system, to humans are extremely likely to be the dominant cause in the climate system. Is that a good return on the investment? It might be from a scientific point of view, and I think actually a lot of scientists still who participate in the IPCC get a lot out of that experience in terms of their own scientific networks, the development of their ideas, career progression, one might even say. But I think the returns for policy processes and for public action and activities is one of ever diminishing returns. And so, I've written about this, that I seriously hope that the IPCC in its sixth assessment will look very, very different from it did in its fifth assessment, but I don't think it will. Inertia within these governmental processes is extremely strong. And although just last week or 2 weeks ago, the IPCC set up a task group, and it will spend 15 months deliberating what the sixth assessment report should look like. My guess is that in 15 months' time, when it reports, it won't look very unlike the fifth assessment report.
It'll just be a bit bigger.
Just be a bit bigger. Well, that's the other thing, yeah. I mean, the volume of these things tripled, quadrupled.
We're getting late on time, so I'm going to take one last question from the audience here and one last one online. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I wanted to thank you for that talk. It's certainly interesting to hear one's youth kind of plotted into that narrative. It's very different from living it. Given some of the topics that we've touched upon today, climate justice, economic opportunism in the face of climate change, the emerging discourse around natural capital and such, and then all of the actors that we have talked about, such as government and the public, I was hoping you could comment on the role of the private sector and business within this narrative, either looking back or going forward. Thank you.
Well, I would summarize its role as ambivalent. I mean, I think, and I preface anything I say that I've had a lot of interaction with different policy institutions and processes, and I've done a lot of work with citizens, different forms of public and cultural engagement. I haven't, at first hand, had a little bit, not a lot of direct engagement within the business world, or the world of the private sector. But I think there's ambivalence over that 25-year period, if you like, that I think clearly there have been sections of industry and business that have been very resistant to the very idea that this is a major public policy issue that requires government intervention, a protection of interests. On the other hand, there have been also very progressive engagements from other parts of the business community to recognize that maybe not so much about climate change, but the broader relationship of businesses to their citizens has to change. So the whole idea of corporate social responsibility, sustainability audits, all of that has grown up over this 25-year period that we've been thinking about. And I think climate change has been part of that sort of background set of ideas that has brought forward that change in business thinking across quite large swathes, I would say, of the business sector. That, of course, hasn't somehow meant that the business community have necessarily done all that they could to reduce emissions, and of course those interests that want to protect particular sectors from government regulation will defend those interests at all costs. And again, I simply come back to my key point here that public life in a complex and heterogeneous world is about multiple interests and people seeking to defend those interests, and to do it through different political processes. And those processes differ from country to country. I mean, the way in which business lobbies in America is very different from the way in which business lobbies in Britain. But it is about interests and recognizing that there are different interests here at stake around climate change, which takes me back to dissensus and to pluralism and to pragmatism, which is to find ways of working with difference in order to still allow action in the public world. So ambivalence would be the way I would describe the business contribution.
Finally, from Gillian in Toronto, I think I know the answer to this question, but let's read it out anyway. If climate change is an opportunity to explore the complexities of human nature life, do you see a place for climate science in humanities, arts-based academic programs? That's from Gillian in Toronto.
Well, I do. It's interesting the way, Gillian, you've asked the question, do I see a place for climate science in humanities and arts-based academic programs? Because other people ask the opposite question. Is there a role for humanities and arts in climate science? And some people within climate science or within climate advocacy movements would say, yes, we need humanities and the arts in order to get our message across. So actually quite an instrumental view of what creative thought and expression is. It is simply there to do this linear model transmission, getting this idea to that person's brain with least distortion and to make it resonate. But you're asking a different question. Is there a place for climate science in humanities and arts programs? And I think that's a more interesting way of asking the question, is that what science is good at doing, and climate science has been generally very good at doing this, is revealing how the climate system works and how humans influence that system in ways that sometimes has been very, very significant. Science is very good at revealing how physical things operate. Science is hopeless, I would suggest, at telling us what that means. Because meaning comes out of our imagination. It comes out of our interpersonal relationships. And those are things that humanities and creative artists work with continually in order to establish and to change and to modulate what things mean for human beings. And so I think actually climate science is offering a new resource, if you will, for these more reflective, imaginative, expressive activities to give substance and meaning and significance. What does climate change actually mean? Well, I'm not going to go to a supercomputer model of the Earth system and run a few simulation models to tell me what climate change means, because that model won't tell me what it means. But I can think about what climate change might mean for me if I'm provoked and stimulated and exposed to creative and imaginative processes that give expression to different ways of thinking about being in the world. And so, yes, absolutely. No, the question's gone. But Gillian, you're right. There is a very important place, I think, for climate science in humanities arts programs. And actually, that's for me, I mean, you introduced me, Simon, my move recently to King's College in London. And the title I've taken on as professor is Professor of Climate and Culture, because I actually think the interaction between those things, between climate and culture, is actually now much more interesting for me personally, anyway, than running a few more computer models and analysing a few more pieces of climate data. I'm actually much more interested in that intersection between climate change and culture.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture in response to the questions. Thank you to the people in the audience who've asked questions, to those of you watching and sending in your questions online. It's been a most interesting evening, and I do appreciate your coming to the symbolic centre of the British Empire these days, with Kitchener and Waterloo and juxtaposed. Thank you very much. Fred, it's all yours.
Yes, I would like to add a few words of thank you as well to Mike Hume for the exceptional presentation this evening, and Simon for excellent moderating and for bringing Mike Hume here to Waterloo. We've been taken tonight on a journey through 25 years of the public life of climate change, and through the rise and the fall of the big plan, the crash of the big plan, to today's popularizing and even cynicizing of the issue. But in this journey, you were considerate enough to lead us around and past the pit of despair and through and to some more positive actions that can be taken in a pluralistic world, some adaptations and mitigations. So for such careful driving, we thank you again. I want to thank the audience for coming out tonight on this evening of local and near-term climate chilling. Appreciate your attendance and invite you to join us in the lobby afterwards, where Professor Hume will be signing copies of his book available for sale at a price of $35 tax in. We have coffee and other decaf coffee and other refreshments available. An edited video of this evening's live webcast will be posted to our website, and we'll also have a blog there in a couple of days where you can post comments and continue the conversation. Our next three events in this CG auditorium include Next Wednesday night on October 30th, we welcome Dr. John Ravenhill, the new director of the Balsley School of International Affairs, to give a lecture entitled, and it's a question, A Crisis in Global Governance. On Thursday, November 7th, CG and the Balsley School jointly present a lecture by Sergei Khrushchev, son of the former Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev, on the issue of what might have happened in the next 6 years had his father and John F. Kennedy not had their terms in office cut short. And on Thursday, November 21st, you're welcome to attend our CG Cinema series for a screening of the film Virtual JFK, presented on the very eve of the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination. Be sure to register for our events newsletter for information on these and other upcoming events. Thank you again for coming tonight. Good night.